Okay, well, so we are contemplating different models of political engagement. I think Thad is going to give us a traditional Thomistic approach to matters of political engagement. And I want to talk to you about what I'm calling the Anabaptist option. This is not a historical talk. I'll mention briefly a few points about the history of this way of thinking. But what I want to try to do is sketch a little argument for thinking this way, and just briefly talk about some of its implications. I only have 20 minutes, so it'll be quick. I have to say, I'm sort of feeling my way into this material. I'm not expert on this, nor am I 100% sure what I think about it. So I'm sort of feeling my way into these things, and with that, I think I'll jump in. So I'm calling this the Anabaptist option. So nonviolentism and withdrawalism in the early church. Those are both non-standard terms. Nonviolentism is a term that has been introduced into the literature, but withdrawalism, as far as I know, is neologism. Neologism? Is that the correct pronunciation? Yes. So prior to the Emperor Constantine's becoming patron of the church in the early 4th century, all known Christian writings that touch on the topic of violence and military and other types of government service implicated in violence urge that Christians should refrain from all types of killing and from military and other governmental service implicated in killing, typically on grounds that killing, whether military or other sorts, contravenes Jesus' teaching on enemy love. Now, that's not to say that the early church was universally pacifist. That's a hotly debated topic. There is evidence in the late 2nd century of Christians serving in the military in small numbers. But it is the case that all of the writings we have pre-Constantine, where the topic of violence and governmental service comes up, have this flavor. And so examples would be, I'll read the middle quote from Tertullian as a kind of standard entry in the list of church writings in this vein. But now inquiry is being made concerning this issues. First, can any believer enlist in the military? Second, can any soldier, even those of the rank and file or lesser grades, who neither engage in pagan sacrifices nor capital punishment, be admitted into the church? No on both counts, for there is no agreement between the divine sacrament and the human sacrament, the standard of Christ and the standard of the devil, the camp of light and the camp of darkness. One soul cannot serve two masters, God and Caesar. But how will a Christian engage in war? Indeed, how will a Christian even engage in military service during peacetime without the sword, which the Lord has taken away? For although soldiers had approached John to receive instruction and a centurion believed this, does not change the fact that afterwards, the Lord, by disarming Peter, disarmed every soldier. Under no circumstances should a true Christian draw the sword, and so forth. So in the early church, there were a number of prominent writers who were defending a combination of views which I'll call non-violentist withdrawalism. So let me define my terms here. Christian nonviolentism, as I'll think about it, is the view that violence against another human being is always impermissible. And for those of you that think about these things, by talk of impermissibility here, I have in mind the idea that violence against another human being is always, all things considered, impermissible, meaning it doesn't matter what other considerations might come into play. You cannot perpetrate violence against another human being, according to this view. That'll be important in a second. By violence, now you might wonder, what's Christian about that? Violence against another human being is always impermissible. You might think that just sounds like nonviolence. What's Christian about it? Well, what's Christian about it is the way I'm using the word violence. So by violence here, I mean the knowing infliction of harm to your neighbor's shalom. And by shalom, I have in mind that communal state of well-being described throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, in which all in the community have their sustenance needs met. All are secure against harms and are treated in accordance with their dignity as image bearers of God. So I think you can make a good case that the agape, as it functions in Jesus' teachings in the gospel depiction of Jesus's love teachings, agape is tied up with the Hebrew Scriptures notion of shalom. That agape is about promoting the shalom of the neighbor. And so it's important to sketch this out, to sketch my view out, that we think about violence in terms of the idea of shalom. So withdrawalism, then, that's an ugly word, is the view that direct complicity in state violence is always impermissible. Indirect complicity is prima facie impermissible. And what that means is that if you find yourself, and I'm going to talk a bit more in a second about what this comes to, but if you find yourself indirectly complicit in some bit of violence perpetrated by the state, that's reason for not doing it. That's reason moral reason for not doing it. But it's moral reason of a kind that can be overridden by other considerations. So an example of this might be, you might think that there's a sense in which you're complicit in the violence of the state insofar as you pay taxes. But the wages of not paying taxes are stiff. You end up in prison, and it's awfully hard to love your family from behind bars, and you might decide that on balance, the moral considerations pull in the direction of paying your taxes. And so the suggestion here then on the part of the withdrawalist is that indirect complicity in the violence perpetrated by states is prima facie impermissible. It's morally problematic, but you might, all things considered, have good reason to do it nevertheless. Okay. And then Christian nonviolentist withdrawalism, which is another expression for the Anabaptist option, is Christian nonviolentism plus withdrawalism. So what the early Christians were teaching and what later came to be the view of many Anabaptist writers was this idea that we should practice nonviolence, we should never use violence against another human being, and we should withdraw from those aspects of governmental involvement that might involve us in violence, police service, military service, and perhaps other kinds of governmental involvement in violence as well. All right, so that's Christian nonviolentist withdrawalism, what I'm calling the Anabaptist option. Now, this is, as I say, it was a widely discussed view in the early church for the first 3 centuries or so. Then you see it again in the Benedictines and the Franciscans in the Catholic monastic tradition in the 6th and 13th centuries, what you might call a clerical nonviolentism. So the Benedictines and the Franciscans taught that for those who are priests or monks or other religious, they need to engage in nonviolence. They need to practice nonviolence and withdrawalism as well. But that the thought was that not everybody needs to, just those who are religious need to do that. You don't see the kind of full-throated defense of nonviolentist withdrawalism, again, in church history that I'm aware of until the 12th century with the Waldensians in France. And then a few centuries later in the writings of the Czech Brethren, who were a small persecuted sect in Bohemia, in modern-day Czech Republic. And then again in the 16th century, the Anabaptist and the Mennonite movement, who would be perhaps who most associate with this point of view, the Anabaptists and the Mennonites. This is in evidence in the writings in more recent times of John Howard Yoder, for instance. He would be one of the more famous proponents of this vein of thought. The Quaker movement in the 17th century. The Garrisonians, by that I mean followers and colleagues of William Lloyd Garrison, the great abolitionist, who was a pacifist and a kind of withdrawalist. He backed off his pacifism as the Civil War became more a possibility. He, in the end, thought, no, violence looks probably like it's justified if it's going to free my African brothers and sisters, and so he backed off. But for quite a while, he was a proponent of what I'm calling the Anabaptist option. Tolstoy, of course, in the 19th century, and then I would include the Catholic worker movement in the 20th century. These various movements had quite a bit of theological diversity among themselves, some quite orthodox, for instance, the Catholic worker movement, some somewhat heterodox, but all proponents of this nonviolentist withdrawalism, as I'm calling it. Okay, so let me say something brief about how you might try to motivate the view. The argument is going to be something like this. Two steps. First, the gospel writer's overall depiction of Jesus' teaching and practice implies an ethic of nonviolence, and if so, withdrawalism. That's the argument. So the defensive premise one on the part of those who hold this sort of thing is going to go like this, or it'll have this flavor. Different folks will defend it differently. But at the heart of the argument for thinking that nonviolentism is in evidence in Jesus' teaching are two teachings elaborated in various ways across the gospel narratives, a positive and a negative teaching about enemy love. The negative teaching, don't resist your enemy, Matthew 5:39, where in context this means, I would argue, don't return harm for harm, or as Paul puts it, don't repay anyone evil for evil. And then the positive teaching, love your enemy. Seek your enemy's shalom, I would argue, is the teaching there. His sustenance, safety against harms, his freedom and dignity. Even those who persecute you and your loved ones unto death. Matthew 5:44 and following, and Matthew 10:16 and following seem to suggest that even those who persecute us, we're to practice this kind of love toward. We're to do good to them, pray for them, bless them, flee from them if necessary, be prepared even to die at their hands, imitating Jesus' acceptance of the cross at the hands of unjust persecutors, but we're to love the enemy come what may. And the first and the second are importantly related, for you might think that sometimes you can't love two people. Sometimes you're in a moral dilemma. What if person A is violently attacking, and unjustly so, at that person B? And the only way to protect person B is to use violence against person A. Then you might think you're in a moral bind here. You can't love both. What should you do? And you might think, indeed I do think, that the negative teaching comes into play here. It provides a kind of constraint on what you can do in the name of love. Do whatever you can in love to protect the person who's the victim of innocent, to protect the innocent victim of aggression, but do it in such a way as to respect the first constraint about not visiting harm for harm. Don't visit violent harm on the person who's perpetrating the evil. Okay, so there's of course much more to say about that, much more, and we don't have time to say any of it. One thing that you might wonder about is whether Jesus' teaching on enemy love and not returning harm for harm is meant to be restricted in some way. So maybe it's only meant to apply in certain contexts. I think there's the interesting action in this discussion. Is there some reason from the text to think that it was meant to be applicable only to certain contexts? And I myself think no. I don't think there is any indication in the text that this teaching on enemy love and non-resistance was intended to apply only to certain contexts. But if you thought so, you'd have reason to reject this kind of nonviolentism. Okay, next, defensive premise 2. So quickly, here's a story. Imagine you live in a region controlled by a powerful and brutally violent drug trafficking cartel. By the way, this isn't meant to be a parable. I'm not suggesting that our government is morally akin to this, but I'm just trying to get your intuitions going. On the whole, though, it's a good place to live. Crime is extremely low because criminals, rare though they be, are subjected to public torture and execution by the cartel. There's little poverty in the region, owing to the fact that the cartel finances an extremely generous social safety net out of the ample profits it makes from its narcotics trafficking operations. Food costs are low because the cartel partially subsidizes food production in the area. Actually, as I understand it, which cartel is it that El Chapo is associated with? There are certain regions of Mexico that are somewhat like this, where the cartel does law enforcement in the area and does a pretty good job of it, and as a result, it was popular among the folks in these villages. Well, suppose now that you're a person of conscience and are aghast at the brutality of the cartel and its narcotics selling ways, but that for whatever reason you have no choice but to live in this region. how should you be disposed toward the cartel government? All right, that's the question. And I want to suggest that your basic goal would be really twofold. One, you'd want to avoid at all costs direct complicity in the violence of the cartel's narcotics trafficking operations. You wouldn't want to sign, again, assuming you're a person of conscience, you wouldn't want to sign up with the death squads and be a thug for the cartel. You wouldn't want that. And you'd try to minimize indirect complicity in the operations of the cartel as much as you could. I mean, on the assumption that you can't leave, you'd be forced into a certain amount of indirect complicity. I mean, you'd have to eat, and since they're subsidizing food, you'd have to participate in some of the fruits of their monies. But you would try to minimize that as much as you could. Where here I'm thinking of direct complicity then is in some wrongdoing is explicitly joining with others in the wrongdoing. And indirect complicity in wrongdoing is something like giving material aid to perpetration of the wrongdoing, advising others how to do it, consenting to, commanding, requesting, or cajoling others to do the wrongdoing, knowingly receiving its fruits, not speaking out against it, or not stopping it if given a chance. That's what I have in mind by indirect complicity in wrongdoing. And so I propose that were you in the situation envisaged in our parable or our story, your goal as a person of conscience would be to avoid direct complicity in cartel violence at all costs and to minimize indirect complicity as best you could. And I think I'll skip to my next slide. And the reason you would do that is because of this general principle. Joining with others in doing things you regard as wrong, by, for example, joining in with the violence of the death squads, is wrong. So it's wrong to join in others in doing things that you regard as wrong. And being indirectly complicit with behavior you regard as wrong, by, for instance, giving material aid to the behavior, condoning it, etc., that's prima facie wrong. Now that's to say, if you're indirectly involved in something you regard as wrong, that's reason to think you shouldn't do it, but it's reason that could be overridden by other factors, okay? All right, question, and my concluding question. What do you do if you're a Christian nonviolentist, committed to the idea that violence of any sort is impermissible, not just the violence of the sort narcotics cartels engage in? What should you do if that's your position? And I want to suggest that you should seek a relationship to the state not unlike the relationship you'd seek in the story of the cartel. You should seek to avoid direct complicity in state violence at all costs and to minimize indirect complicity as best you can. That is to say, you should practice withdrawalism. Now, I was going to say something about the ways in which the state is implicated in violence, but I think I'll just leave that at the obvious level. Policing, military, various kinds of law enforcement activities. So the thought is that if you thought all violence was impermissible, you would naturally seek to not enlist in the military, or if you were in the military, try to be in it in such a way that you aren't participating in violence. You would try to pursue a profession that didn't have you indirectly committing to or participating in military or police violence. And your life would look sort of like Tertullian was urging in the initial quote that we read. So now what does that mean in terms of political engagement? And I'll just conclude with this remark. It's an interesting question whether political engagement in the sense of voting, serving in public office, involves you in indirect participation in the violence of the state. You might think that voting is a kind of consent to the state's activities, many of which are violent. You might think that serving in public office involves you in enforcing laws that are ultimately enforced by threat of or actual use of violence. And so you might then have real questions, if you were a Christian nonviolentist of this stripe I've been sketching here, you might have real questions about whether you can vote and whether you can serve in public office. So it might be that your withdrawalism will be even more thoroughgoing than just not serving in the military, not being a gun-carrying police officer. It might be that you would avoid public office, perhaps not even vote. Such then is a quick sketch of an argument for Christian nonviolentist withdrawalism, or the Anabaptist option. The view I've arrived at is very similar to the kinds of views that have been defended by folks in the Anabaptist movement over the years. And here's a quick indication how you might arrive at such a view. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, so thanks to Tom for a compelling presentation of Anabaptist option. If I have a title for my talk, it would be Mr. Aquinas Goes to Washington. Thomistic natural law theory is a hopeful middle ground between both religious and secular totalitarianism. And my premise in this is one of the deepest insights I've ever had into politics came from my 6-year-old when she was 3. This is going back a couple years, and I'm typing away in my home office, working on an article for the journal Christian Legal Thought, and I overhear in the other room, within earshot, my then 3-year-old, Holland is her name, we call her Dutchie. Dutchie is watching a little Disney junior show called Small Potatoes. And it's these adorable little animated potatoes with, very Draycott-esque British accents, makes them very cute. And they hop around and sing these catchy little songs in their British accents. And I'm kind of thumb-tapping away to this song. And the song is called We're All Potatoes at Heart. And it's this potato-sung punk rock anthem about kind of doing your own thing, being a nonconformist. And every little episode ends with the moral of the story. And it's the cutest potato of all. We'll stand in front of the camera. And the moral of this particular story was, and this is a direct quote from the episode, "There's no right or wrong way to do anything, children. Do what you want." And the credits roll. And so I go, racing into the living room and do a dive roll and grab the clicker and change the station and, proceeded to give my 3-year-old an extensive lecture on the Decalogue and Thomistic natural law theory, and I got her all sorted out. But what struck me about that was the night and day contrast between the kind of Disney I was raised on. One of my favorite Disney movies growing up was Pinocchio. And if you think about the plot line of Pinocchio, this whole tale of this Italian puppet transpires in a morally structured universe. Right? There's a moral structure to reality, so that he's on this quest to become a real boy, and when he breaks the moral structure of reality, it kind of breaks him back. He actually becomes less of a real boy. Right? If you analyze the plot line, when he goes off to pursue fame and fortune on Stromboli's stage, and when he tells a lie, he actually becomes further from the goal of real boyhood, right? His nose turns into like a tree trunk. And when he goes off to Pleasure Island and shuns all responsibility, he turns into a donkey, right? Even further from the goal of real boyhood. And by the end of the tale, this little Italian puppet participates in an act of altruism and courage, and ultimately sacrifices his life to save his dad, Geppetto, from Mostro, the sea monster. And it's in that act that he loses his life and resurrects in the final scene as a real boy. Now, the message, even to a little 5-year-old Thad watching that, was that there's a moral structure to reality. There's a way to be a real boy. You see the night and day contrast, this worldview shift that has occurred from the Disney I was raised on to Small Potatoes telling my child there's no right or wrong way to do anything. And so that shift from a Pinocchio universe to a Small Potatoes universe, I suggest is the shift that we're watching happening all around us in American politics these days. That shift, which is really at its core an anthropological shift. It's a different answer to the question, what does it fundamentally mean to be human? And so this is where I think Aquinas has a lot of insight to speak into our political situation. If I had to throw out kind of a thesis for the day, it would be this: that all law and politics are anthropological, which is to say that there's no such thing as neutrality in government. Every law and political system rests on and seeks to advance some view of what it means to be human. some definition of human flourishing. This is one reason I would argue that a Christian voice with biblical insight into human nature is so essential to 21st century politics. If we get human nature wrong, we get law and policy wrong, and people get hurt. If we get human nature right, then people are blessed whether or not they're Christian. And so if I could, before diving into the real meat of a Thomistic view here, just give you one more example of how anthropology is at the root of most of the political conundrums of the 21st century. I could illustrate it with the legislation, this is going back over a decade, to try to save the spotted owls in the northwestern United States forests. You had these spotted owls, they were an endangered species, and so the question was, what do we do to save these poor animals? Well, legislation was advanced that effectively shut down the lumber industry in some of these states, which had all kinds of unforeseen consequences on the economy of these different states. But what's most interesting to the point I'm getting at is that while this environmental legislation significantly restricted the lumber industry with the aim of preserving the owl's natural habitat, lumberjacks struggled to cope with unemployment, and the forests that they once cut grew denser. By some accounts, the northern spotted owl, with an average wingspan of 6 feet, had an increasingly difficult time navigating the crowded trees to reach the forest floor, where wood rats, the primary food source for spotted owls, scurried freely. So with less accessible sustenance, the spotted owl populations continued to dwindle in the very forests where they were intended to thrive. How could legal efforts toward spotted owl thriving achieve such ironic results? The answer is an inadequate owlology. An inadequate understanding of spotted owls, failing to understand that you need some room in your forest. If they're 6-foot wingspan, they're going to make it to the floor to eat their wood rats, their primary sustenance. So the moral of the story is that bad owlology leads to a false concept of owl flourishing, which in turn leads to bad policy, and finally, the harm of the very animals that people were seeking to help. So the lesson is clear when we begin to talk about law and politics, that laws and policies that seek to promote ethical flourishing of our species, the difference between those and the ones that morally damage the very people they seek to improve, it's all going to come down to our anthropology, our view of human nature. Good anthropology is a necessary condition of good law and politics. And so I'm just going to lay out, just kind of rapidly fire away here, 6 principles for a Christian worldview that speak into politics, give us a more robust anthropology for having more helpful public policy. So I'm going to hit these pretty quick, and then I'm really going to zero in on the last one, which is where I think Thomas has a lot to teach us. First, people are not designed to be supreme authorities over the hearts of other men, and are therefore seriously limited in their capacity to legislatively inculcate virtue. In other words, because God is sovereign, the merely human government is not. Can I get an amen for that? Because God is sovereign, the merely human government is not. Given his unique authority and access to the human heart, God can, in Paul's language, cause us to increase and abound in love. His Spirit can produce the fruits of love, joy, peace, patience, and kindness in Galatians 5. It can mortify the deeds of the flesh, in the language of Romans 8, in ways that human law can't. State-enforced legislation, therefore, is no substitute for divinely affected heart transformation. Second, people are designed as meaningful choice makers and can therefore be constructively encouraged, but not coercively engineered to virtue. In other words, we're more than the sum of our biology and economic particulars. This means that any law or political ideology that treats people less as choice makers and more like Pavlovian canines, who can be socially engineered, will have vicious results. Virtues like generosity and charity are what Princeton's Robert George calls reflexive virtues, which means that they must be chosen voluntarily and not by human coercion to retain their moral value. And that's an insight, just as a side note, that helps us understand why many economic policies of mass-scale forced redistribution tend to deliver so little on their promises of a more generous and charitable society. Third, people are designed to thrive when diverse, finite, and divinely delegated spheres of authority are left intact. Martin Luther famously quipped that the home in marriage served as a far more rigorous school for character than the monastery. God has created these diverse spheres and imbued them each with mutually complementary, not mutually canceling powers to realize his good vision for his creatures' flourishing. Governments are ordained with the delegated authority for our good, in Paul's language, Romans 13, as the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. And yet this divinely delegated duty of government does not replace or repress the unique and far more personal duties of the church to discipline communities towards Christ-like virtue, or the unique duties of parents to raise up their children in the way of the Lord. This means that legal or political systems that suppress or swallow up these far more intimate virtue-seeking institutions violate human nature and will turn vicious. Number 4, people are morally fallen to such a radical extent that any political program, including the ones we support, should be met with a realistic caution that seriously reckons with our enormous capacity for corruption. This anthropological insight protects us from the naive optimism of certain systems that champion the inherent goodness of man and tend, without exception, to turn utopian dreams into dystopian nightmares. The depth of human evil also reminds us that legislative solutions cannot resolve the most rudimentary spiritual problems within our nature. Number 5, people need grace to realize their most ultimate meaning and fulfillment. Law and politics are no substitute for the gospel. The chief end of man, as the Westminster theologians recognize, is the glorification and enjoyment of God. And we cannot reach this chief end through any earthly courtroom. We reach it only through the courtroom of heaven, where Jesus intercedes as our defense attorney, seeking our not guilty verdict with the irrefutable case of his own shed blood. And last, number 6, where we'll really get into what Aquinas has to teach us for the 21st century. Number 6 is that people have natures that they don't invent but discover. There's a 6th anthropological insight, and with it comes the insight that any law or political system that contradicts this nature will be oppressive and dehumanizing. Laws based on human nature hold real potential to bring about human flourishing in the realm of law and politics. And so let me zero in on number 6 there, and I'm going to set it in a bit of a historic context for you. Looking at the clock, I'm going to give you the 2-minute version of about 200 years of Western jurisprudence. So hold on to your seats. I'm going to step away from the mic here and just project for you. One way of thinking about how law and politics fit together can be pictured as a tree. And I'm going to use Thomistic categories here to paint the picture for you. Any legal system that's anchored in what Aquinas calls eternal law. This is, for Aquinas, God's will for the entire cosmos. This is God's plan for the flourishing of all of creation. Now, as the eternal law, the roots of law, sprout above the soil, we get what Aquinas calls divine law. Divine law equals, in a Christian context, Old and New Testaments. This is God's, verbal inspiration, His message to humanity, His revealed will for human flourishing. Now, growing from that, you have at the very top all the fruit, all the leaves, all the branches on top are what Aquinas calls human law, or sometimes he calls it positive law. Now, the idea in this way of thinking about Christianity and politics would say that God's eternal law for everything sprouts into the Scriptures, the divine law, His will for human thriving, which every valid human law in a political system should grow from that tree trunk of divine law. Old and New Testaments in a Christian context, the Quran in an Islamic context or a Sharia context. Now, this way of thinking about things, if there's a law up here that contradicts the divine law of God, it falls off the tree. It's a rotten human law. Aquinas would say it's no law at all because it doesn't grow from the trunk of divine law. Now, this way of thinking about the relationship to God's will and politics and law, we might call theocracy. where the law of God equals the law of the land. And Thomas is no theocrat. He's going to advance a different vision of how this looks. So picture that tree, the theocrat's tree, on one end of the forest. On the opposite end, what we face today looks something like this. You have a bush of human law, all the fruits, all the leaves, all the branches, and there's no trunk underneath it. There's no scripture underneath it. There's no appeal to any kind of transcendent norms or values. It's purely what those in power say. The name for this bush, it's less of a tree, more of a bush, is legal positivism. Legal positivism. All that's required for a law to be just is that it's posited by those in power. And so you have these opposite ends of what we might call the forest of law and politics. And Thomas is going to give us an alternative right down the middle. And so the Thomistic natural law theory looks like this. You have the roots down here, God's eternal law. As those roots sprout above ground, the trunk splits into two. The right trunk is what Aquinas calls natural law. From natural law should sprout our human laws. The left trunk is divine law, which sprouts into Old Testament and New Testament. Now for Aquinas, that's what his tree would look like if we're staying consistent with the metaphor here. You have the divine law. This is the domain of the church. The church is where we teach Scripture and live Scripture. Over here, natural law is, in Paul's language from Romans 2, this is the law God writes on every human conscience. It's called natural law not because we learn it looking out in nature and taking moral notes on how ants have a good work ethic or anything like that. We learn natural law because it's written in human nature. Before you open the Bible and read Exodus 20, you already know that you shouldn't murder. Why? Because it's written on the tablet of your heart. Before you open Deuteronomy 5 and 6 and read that you should not bear false witness, you already know it's wrong to lie. Why? Because it's written on the human heart. Now, because the natural law is universal, it's anchored anthropologically in human nature, it's not oppressive to have human laws and political systems that flow from the trunk of natural law. Do you see in a theocratic model, you could have a New Testament command, repent and believe the gospel. For a theocrat, that should become human law. For a natural law theorist, they would say, well, not everybody knows that. That's special revelation. But everybody does know, because it's written on every human heart, that you shouldn't break your contracts, you shouldn't lie, that you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't take the things that aren't yours. There should be property laws that reflect that natural law, that you shouldn't murder, and so on. And so there's a Thomistic way that I think is a helpful middle ground between theocracy on the one end, which is a scary word in our culture, and the legal positivism that we see where it's just sheer will to power coming from the opposite side. Now, what happened in the last 100 years or so is as things began to increasingly secularize and the roots of eternal law were taken away, and the divine law was largely erased from our political institutions, there were several attempts in Western culture to try to prop up some kind of trunk underneath our political systems and legal structures. In every one of them, at the end of the day, the trunk isn't sturdy enough because it isn't anchored in deep roots of God's law. So those trunks tend to buckle over and you end up with the bush of legal positivism on the ground. So, for example, you have what's known in jurisprudence as the CLS movement, critical legal studies. The critical legal studies movement said that what should the trunk be underneath human law? Equality. Economic equality, gender equality, fill in the blank. You had the law and economics perspective that picked up momentum in the 80s. The law and economics perspective says, well, what should the trunk be that all human law should sprout from? And the answer for them was economic efficiency. Law shouldn't have any moral foundation. It should only be about dollars and cents. Does this legislation, does this public policy enhance what Richard Posner calls wealth maximization? You have what in the literature is known as queer critical theory. Queer critical theory would say underneath all human laws, to determine whether or not they're just, you need gender equality and sexual equality. Now again, the takeaway point here is that all of these are really attempts at doing something like Aquinas did, but without deep enough roots. And so every attempt of the last 100 years in jurisprudence to prop up some tree trunk underneath our political systems tends to topple over and turn into the bush of raw power and legal positivism. So that's a short version, the 20-minute version of Thomistic natural law theory and what we have to learn from St. Thomas for our current political moment. Thank you very much.
I'm going to invite Tom back up here to respond to any questions you have. I've heard two talks that are asking pretty different questions. And they're asking different questions that come from different positions, both one in to Scripture and Christian tradition. So I think there's a good conversation that can be had. I'd love you guys to facilitate that for us with your questions. You can direct them at any one individual, but let's not just pick on one speaker, so make sure that we give them both a chance to articulate their thoughts a little further. So we'll start with Doug.
So my question is for Tom about the rationale and motivation given for this Anabaptist perspective option, rooted in what Jesus said in the passage in question. You thought that there was little, if any, textual support for making exceptions of another sort. But it seems to me that that's going to be true more generally than you allow as you develop a position, which is to say that there are conditions under which you might, you never use this language, choose the lesser of two evils, but do the thing that's less complicit. He doesn't make exceptions of that sort either. And so I wonder first if you follow the motivation to the nth degree, assuming that the context really provides you with enough data here. If you should just be willing to, bite the bullet and pay the ultimate price in any situation where complicit behavior might seem the only alternative. And in addition to that, I wonder if you want to broaden the context in terms of which Jesus would actually be teaching what he had to say, to include how God's wrath and his goodness are combined in, say, the Old Testament, where he not only authorizes what looks like violent behavior, but he's complicit because of the miracles he works to get the results that the Israelites do when, for example, they blow the trumpets and the walls fall down.
Yeah, so on the first, I do think you see examples of Jesus either enjoining or engaging in indirect complicity in state violence. So it looks like he pays taxes at one point. He participates in the marketplace, which would involve money making its way through the tithing and taxation system into violent governmental activities. So Jesus is not a total withdrawalist in the style of the Essenes who withdrew to the desert to be completely isolated from society. He does engage in societal life in the marketplace and in other ways. And so that it looks like that does involve him in a kind of indirect complicity in state violence. And so I read that as suggesting that that kind of complicity, though it should be avoided, I think given the other of his teachings, it should be avoided if possible, if there are overriding considerations that push in that direction, then it's okay. But nevertheless, one must try to avoid the kind of direct violence against enemy that I think his enemy love teachings were explicitly addressing. So on the latter point, yeah, the question of what to make of the Old Testament violence, some of which was quite considerable, I think you have to say that something new was being taught in Jesus' teaching, and that it had to do with the advent of the kingdom, which in Old Testament thought would be a time when war would cease and when swords would be pounded into plowshares and so forth. And I think that one possible read of it, there are a lot of different ways of doing this, but one possible read of it is that Jesus was enjoining on his disciples something genuinely new, that the nonviolence he was instructing them to wasn't something that was around in Old Testament thought or teaching. And then there's the question, well, what to make of God? Is God nonviolent? And that's a hard question. It doesn't look like it. But I would maintain that Jesus was enjoining his disciples to be nonviolent.
So I had a question for the second speaker. I was wondering how you reconcile the anthropology of like the absolute corruption of the human heart and the need for grace and revelation with natural law.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thomas answers by creating some distinctions between different kinds of virtue. He would say there are, for lack of a better term, secular virtues that legal systems can encourage, incentivize, and use the coercive power of law to disincentivize non-virtue or vice. And so that's in a distinct box in Thomas's head from supernatural virtues. And so he speaks of supernatural virtues like faith, love, and hope that require, the English would be a divine infusion for Aquinas, habitus infusus, that God infuses these divine habits in us. And so that's where Aquinas' categories, I think, are helpful, that where theocracies have gone wrong historically is the attempt to effectively play God by taking only supernaturally infused habits and trying to use the coercive force of law to make those happen. And that's, G.K. Chesterton had the famous quote, "Once we abolish God, the government becomes God." And I think you find that happening both in historic theocracies and today in a lot of the more totalitarian political systems on the rise, is an attempt to we will use the force of law to get you love by our standard of what love means, or else. And so that's some thoughts there, which is why when I was kind of enumerating, here's 6 anthropological insights, my 5th one is that everything I'm talking about, Thomas's natural law theory, is no substitute for the gospel, for the heart regenerating work of the Holy Spirit. So, good question. Nicholas?
Well, you're on the other end of the spectrum from totalitarian governments. How does this all intersect with thinking about democratic governments? Because Thomas was pre-democracy, so he's not really taking into account considerations that we would have today, where we could look at the bush on the ground and say, well, it's just acting on its own power, but if it represents the power of the people, then it's okay. That would be our thinking now. How would you think that through?
Yeah, good question. I'm going to have to speculate a lot here. But my first pass at it would be to say, when it comes to being a Christian in a democratic nation, I want to pursue the candidates and I want to pursue the public policies that comport with human nature. Not in its fallen state, that's not what Aquinas is getting at. But and Aquinas identifies, by the way, the natural law equals the Decalogue for him. So everybody knows it's written in your heart that you shouldn't take what's not yours. Everybody knows it's written in your heart that you shouldn't bear false witness, that you shouldn't murder. Both tablets, actually, for him, the first and the second. The first being your duties to God, and the second, your duties to man. And that's where it gets into a very complex conversation about what does it look like to have a human law that reflects the first command to have no idols before God. And Aquinas is going to lay out a whole series of distinctions there, basically arguing that here the state shouldn't at the end of the day turn theocratic. But anyway, for me, the question is, when I'm weighing candidates, when I'm weighing political policies, does this advance the human good insofar as it reflects human nature? And so I look at hot potato topics like abortion, and now there's a way in the public forum to cross the epistemic chasm between somebody who puts stock in Scripture for their worldview and somebody who doesn't. Because of human nature being shared, Paul's argument in Romans 2, because of the law written in the heart, everybody knows thou shalt not murder. And so now it's going to be an important conversation. It's not the pro-life versus the pro-murder debate, right? It's not a fundamental moral disagreement. It's a disagreement about the non-moral question, when does human life begin? And so when it comes to these kind of hot potato political topics, I would argue more Thomistically and say, let's have that conversation so I can tap into what you already know deep in your core, taking innocent human life is wrong. So that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of the answer to a very complex question. Any other questions for Tom? Go ahead.
I have a question for Tom. In your advocating of this withdrawal and baptism, how does it connect with, where would you place the requirement of nonviolent resistance?
Yeah, right. So, so I think maybe in some ways calling it withdrawalism is slightly inapt, because I don't think the view I'm describing entails or implies a total withdrawal from political involvement. It entails a withdrawal from political involvement of a kind that has you indirectly or directly complicit in state violence, but you still have the injunction to love your neighbor and to seek justice, and so how to do that then? And this wasn't a robust part of the Anabaptist tradition, but has become more so in recent years. So one way to do that is to pursue tactics of nonviolent direct action, where you are engaging the state, you're engaging structures that may be unjust, but doing it in a way which is thoroughgoingly nonviolent. And the field of nonviolence and nonviolent political action has been under hot discussion and theoretical work since Gandhi, and there's been quite a lot of successes in a recent study of large-scale campaigns to expel foreign invaders and overturn brutal dictatorships. There was a large-scale study done of attempts to do both these things, and a couple of researchers argued in the study that nonviolent attempts to do this were twice as effective from 1900 on until 2005 at those two tasks as compared with violent campaigns. And so there's been a lot of work done on this. It's been tried a lot around the world in large-scale conflict, and it's been very effective.
One last question. I don't know whose hand went up there first. So, okay, Tim.
This is for Tom. How do you deal with scriptures like Jesus using a scourge to overturn the temple, the tables in the temple, because there was injustice, or it seems like he stopped, in Romans 12 and didn't go to Romans 13 when it talked about that the government is given so that it can enforce, and it seems that it uses the term, he does not use the sword in vain.
Yes.
And it seems like it calls those people that are in government ministers of God.
Right.
So how do you reconcile that with a withdrawalism and a nonviolent picture, totally nonviolent picture of how we're supposed to operate?
Yeah. So the text describing Jesus using the scourge doesn't say he scourged any people. So I don't think we have a clear indication there of Jesus visiting violence on other human beings. But we do have him engaged in a kind of aggressive protest that I think is perfectly in order, given the kind of non-violentist withdrawalism I'm defending. On the point about Romans 13, I hold to a kind of Anabaptist read of that, which says that what Paul is describing there is the way in which God orders something which is bad, namely the violence of the state. Because remember, Paul's talking about Rome when he writes that, which is a brutal, horrifically brutal political world and institution. And what Paul is suggesting, I think, is God orders that for good. the good of creating a just, stable, peaceful political order. So God orders it for good. He takes what is bad, the behavior of Rome, and orders it for good. But nowhere in that text, as I read it, does Paul suggest that Christians should participate in that violence. So Romans 13, I don't think, is describing something that Christians should be doing. So that's how I read that text.
Thank you very much. Let's express our thanks to our speakers for their time.
Biola University prepares Christians to think biblically about everything, from science to business to education and the arts. Learn more at biola.edu.